This weekend, I was asked a question by a fellow role-playing game enthusiast about running Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars system, Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion. This individual, whose very heart beats the rhythm of role-playing games, whose blood is liquefied dice, asked me what it was like to move from, let's say, more traditional games, older games, into something like this, where the dice can contribute so much, but do so in a non-specific way. He asked about the difference between the very specific experience you might get in a chart-based game, or a clearly defined system of results, compared to more open-ended games. The difference between choosing a spell from a spell list and open-ended magic is what we're talking about when we get into things like the Force, or the effects of damage, the way that combat works, that ranges work. This system, although easy, quick to learn, it has an appearance to it when you first pick up the rule book and you first start seeing your old familiar friends: opposed, roll, short range, close range, engaged, not engaged, stunned. These types of terms. You see them and you think, I can run this game. And then as you read more deeply, you convince yourself that you can't, or that it's hard, or that it'll be slow, or that you won't feel confident, or that your players won't understand, or they'll take too much control, or they won't take enough control. Worry can do an awful lot. While Han Solo would tell us not to get cocky, Ben Kenobi would tell us, trust your feelings. The first feelings. It's cool. It's familiar. Don't go with the terrified feelings that are being planted by Vader, who wants you to chicken out, back down, put the game away, and sigh dramatically, saying, oh, I wish I could run that game, but obstacles. Well, it is possible to run the game. You will probably find that it's very quick and easy to do so, and I'm happy to take a look at this question. About 1,000 years ago, when I was in college, a friend of mine brought out Rolemaster. I'd never seen Rolemaster before, and we started flipping through it and talking about, using it, of course, because it was our experimental phase. And then we got into the charts, and some of us were really excited to get into that level of detail. So many different types of critical effects, so many long lists of variation in effects. As a game master, you had to understand what effects existed within the system, know when to call for them, be facile enough with the material so that you could bring them out in play quickly, or at least match the pace of your players so that this tool was a tool, was an aid, was a benefit, and not a detriment. You have to learn to play the game you have. You can't make it be a game it's not. A lot of people love Rolemaster. They love the delicious amount of detail. As we get older, as time pressures mount, this kind of game may get pushed into the background for one that's easier, faster, takes less time. Star Wars from Fantasy Flight Games is somewhere in the middle. It can return an incredible amount of detail, but this detail is not truly tied to anything specific. There are things like critical tables, where after characters have achieved or passed their wound threshold, they enter into critical damage territory, which might be things like being knocked back, being stunned for a moment, having a higher difficulty to act, or losing body parts. The game allows for as much detail as you might like, or at the same time empowers you to know when it's time to gloss over that, when it's time to move past that. And I guess over the last 8 months that I've been running the game, and the last month and a bit where I've been watching members of my group start running the game themselves, the thing that's striking me is that the game becomes really fun when you are willing to let the results returned by the dice be elastic. And what I mean by that is, if you're in a combat situation, ship to ship, person to person, you have these very small, very manageable charts that give you hints about how advantages or threats can be spent in order to color or enhance the combat scene. I imagine most groups sort of slavishly adhere to these charts, where 1 advantage or 3 advantages equals exactly this effect and only this effect, but that is not their intent. These are guidelines. You learn to interpret them, go with them. And when it comes time for criticals, you want to be descriptive. An advantage can be used to reduce the amount of strain or fatigue that a character is taken, or it can be passed on to the next ally in order to give them a boost in their combat, and then those players will narrate how that advantage is passed. That's cool. This can also be a threat, a disadvantage, a setback die passed on to the next opponent, and you would narrate again what deleterious effect is headed their way. Understanding the scale between 1 advantage, 2 advantages, 4 advantages, a triumph, a despair, understanding the scale between them is important. But a set scale from scene to scene, from hour to hour of gameplay, is much less important. And I find that that was what tripped me up the most when I started running the game. And it was one thing that I hoped I was able to demonstrate getting over before anybody else tried to run the game in my group. And it's mostly what I want to talk about today. What is 1 advantage? What is 1 triumph or 1 despair? Well, everything is interpreted within the scene. So, for example, we were playing last night, and the game master had created a scenario where we had to infiltrate as rebel agents. We had to infiltrate a base in order to free recently captured rebel prisoners before they could be interrogated. And as we were trying to set up support so that not only could we get to these people, but get back out, we, of course, were rolling threats. We were getting advantages, we were getting successes, we were occasionally getting triumphs. Despair didn't play much of a role, which was very welcome. But threats from time to time would outnumber advantages. And what would these mean? It could have been interpreted in a variety of different ways, and that's the beauty of the game. Each person in the game master's seat of pretty much any game is going to give it their own distinct flavor or feel. And this is true here as well. Someone could have been very by the book, and for every threat rolled, applied strain to us. We're starting to panic as pressures mount, as time pressure builds. We're getting stressed, and we're starting to look over our shoulders. This could have been interesting. It could have been used as setback dice on the next thing that we were going to do. Like, we're disabling different consoles. We are planting charges to cause distractions and take out key pieces of equipment. Setback dice could have been building up to make that harder and harder, representing a greater degree of likelihood of guards coming on the scene. How it was actually interpreted in play was great. The threats were being applied to as bonuses to, let's say, a perception check for the security chief. So the longer we were out there doing things we're not supposed to be doing, the more likely he would become to detect us. It's great. Simple, clean. Game Master just needs to keep track of how many threats are actually popping up, and at appropriate times make a check and see if our skullduggery is uncovered. I loved it. So one threat in a combat might be one strain. It might be a setback die. Right? One threat over the course of a whole scene might represent something else completely. It might be a very specific effect, and it might be a much more narrative effect. How do we decide? I feel the trick to this is recognizing that it's possible to get multiples of any of the symbols in the game: success, failure, advantage, threat, triumph, despair. You could have one triumph. You could have two triumphs. So you take a look at what's going on, and you take a look at the dice that are actually thrown. And if it's possible for only one triumph to be thrown in that particular die pool, maybe you will feel compelled to weight it more heavily. If it's possible for another character in the group to have thrown 2, 3, maybe 4 triumphs, you might feel like, well, that was only one triumph. But the interpretation, the consistent interpretation, is much more important than that consideration. Understanding, by becoming familiar with the provided charts about what kind of effects were envisioned for these symbols, is the first step. And then, once play is happening all around you, once you're charging down through the emerging story, well, what does it mean right now? What would a triumph be right now? How could despair become involved right now? Now, if you're the kind of game master who really likes to exert influence on the story, you might weigh this against what you hope will happen, or where the story is flowing from your perspective. You're trying to get them from point A to point B in a narrative arc. What would be despair at this point for you? For me, where I'm all about seeing what happens, I try to interpret it in terms of the situation itself in relation to nothing else. What would be a major setback? What would be a cause of despair for the character right now? Is it something like the catwalk they're on giving way, right? Dropping them into a precarious position? Or would it be separation from their group? Or would it be, the loss of a useful piece of equipment? What would 2 despair mean? What would 3 despair mean? What would despair plus triumph? How would that work? Right? Thinking about this stuff can drive you a little crazy, but I find in the heat of the moment, you can find your way through it. And the players are there to help. The players have a much more detailed representation of the scene through their characters' eyes than you do. You've got this bird's eye view looking down on the scene as the game master, and you're juggling a lot of details, like, is there smoke, and is the ground shaking, and what's the timeline on reinforcements arriving, and that sort of thing. All these things are running in the back of your mind, but that player, they're inside their character's head, and they're charging into the next interaction. The dice are rolled, and they're looking down. They're the ones who build the pool. They recognize that this setback die is because there are observers, and they recognize that this boost die is because they're working together, making sure this is going to happen. And that boost die is because of the great gear that they bought at that black market in the last space station. All of this is very personal, very real. That pool is not just a bunch of plastic dice. That pool is the very meat of the scene, and it's the building blocks of the next stage of imagination. So when those dice stop rolling, they're looking down and they're seeing where those results come from. So give them the space, and they start talking about how many successes they got, and they separate those, and you can see them very clearly across the table. You can see they got 3 successes. Whatever it was that they attempted, they've definitely succeeded. But there's a threat. That setback die you added in for those stormtrooper observers, well, that turned up actually mattering. There is a threat applied. The stormtroopers that you set to watch them have applied a threat, or 2 threats, or 3 threats. How do you want to interpret that? When you spell it out in your head as actual scene elements, not as numbers of this and amounts of that, but if you spell it out in your head as scene elements, everything becomes clear. There couldn't possibly be enough charts, there couldn't possibly be enough printed detail to guide the game master through running a game, just like there isn't for any other game. But as you approach this game, as you approach interpreting dice in any game, allow that to be filtered through what people are actually imagining, the shared imagination between you and the individual imaginations that each of us keep to ourselves and sometimes share. Allow that to determine what those dice mean. Allow those dice to color, shape, mold, and guide that imagination, and you will have a very exciting, very, very true to Star Wars game, and you'll love it. And I can't wait to hear about it.